The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and fear. Victoria Ashford, 17 years old, pale as the sheets wrapped around her, stared at the ceiling while her father paced near the window. The doctors had just delivered the verdict, 7 days, maybe less. Her kidneys were shutting down, her immune system collapsing under the weight of a rare autoimmune disease that had already burned through every treatment money could buy. Richard Ashford, billionaire tech mogul, owner of half the commercial real estate in the city, had built an empire on solving impossible problems. But this was the one equation he couldn't crack. And then the door opened. A young woman stepped inside, 23, maybe 24, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that moved across the room like she was cataloging everything. She wore the simple uniform of the housekeeping staff, but something about the way she held herself didn't quite match. She looked at Victoria, and for just a second, her expression flickered. Not pity, not curiosity, but something deeper. Recognition, like she was seeing a ghost. Richard barely glanced at her. "We're in the middle of something," he said, his voice tight. The young woman didn't move. "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I'm here." How could a maid possibly know what was happening in this room? 2 days earlier, the Ashford estate had been running on autopilot. Richard spent 18 hours a day on calls with specialists from Switzerland, Japan, experimental clinics that promised miracles and delivered invoices. His wife, Margaret, had stopped coming to the hospital altogether. She couldn't handle watching their daughter fade. The staff kept the house immaculate, the gardens trimmed, the illusion of normalcy intact. That's when the new housekeeper arrived. Her name was Elena Cross, and she'd been hired through an agency Richard's assistant had used before. References were solid. Background check came back clean. She started on a Monday, barely speaking to anyone, moving through the halls like she'd been there before. She dusted the library where Victoria used to read. She cleaned the piano no one played anymore. She organized the medicine cabinet in the upstairs bathroom with the kind of precision that seemed almost medical. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, watched her carefully. "You've done this kind of work before?" Elena nodded. Different houses. Same routine. But Mrs. Calloway noticed something odd. When Elena cleaned Victoria's bedroom, the one she hadn't slept in for weeks, she paused at the bookshelf, ran her fingers along the spines of old novels, stopped at a framed photo on the nightstand. Victoria at 14, laughing at some birthday party, holding a stuffed elephant she'd named Marlowe. Elena stared at that photo longer than she should have. And when Mrs. Calloway cleared her throat, Elena flinched, turned away, and went back to work without a word. Richard came home that evening looking like he'd aged a decade. He barely acknowledged the staff, just walked straight to his office and shut the door. Elena was in the hallway, polishing a mirror, when Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs. Margaret Ashford was the kind of woman who wore pearls to breakfast and never let anyone see her cry. But tonight, her makeup was smudged, her hands shaking as she gripped the banister. Elena set down her cloth. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "can I get you anything?" Margaret looked at her, really looked, and for a moment, something passed between them. A flicker of something Elena couldn't name. "Do you have children?" Margaret asked. The question hung in the air. Elena hesitated. "No," she said finally. Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Then you can't possibly understand what it's like to watch yours die." She turned and walked back to her room, leaving Elena alone in the hallway. But if Mrs. Calloway had been watching, she would have seen the way Elena's hands clenched, the way her jaw tightened, the way she whispered something under her breath that sounded a lot like, "Yes, I can." The first real signal came the next morning. Richard had left files spread across the kitchen table, medical reports, experimental trial data, consent forms for procedures that sounded more like science fiction than medicine. He'd gone upstairs to shower. Elena was supposed to be cleaning the adjacent dining room, but she stopped when she saw the papers. She shouldn't have looked. Staff didn't touch personal documents. But she did. She read through the pages with a speed that suggested familiarity, not just literacy, but comprehension. Medical terminology that would have been gibberish to most people. When she reached the genetic marker analysis, her breathing changed. Her finger traced a line of text, HLA mismatch, No viable family donors identified. Richard's voice came from the hallway. Elena had maybe 3 seconds. She set the papers down exactly as she'd found them and picked up her spray bottle, wiping down the table's edge like that's all she'd been doing. Richard walked in, grabbed the files without looking at her, and left. But he'd missed something. A single page had slipped to the floor. Elena picked it up. It was a donor registry search result, dated from 6 months ago. Every match had been crossed out. Incompatible. Too far. Wrong age. Declined. At the bottom, someone had written in pen, "Need alternative options." Overseas? Black market? Elena folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. If Mrs. Calloway had asked, she would have said she was keeping it to return to Mr. Ashford. But that would have been a lie, because Elena already knew what that paper meant, and she knew what she had to do. That afternoon, a man named Julian Hayes arrived at the estate. He was Margaret's brother, a venture capitalist with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and a habit of treating staff like furniture. He hugged Margaret in the foyer, all performance, and told her everything would be fine, that the family would get through this. Richard shook his hand without warmth. "Julian." "Richard, I came as soon as I heard. How's Victoria?" "Dying." The word landed like a slap. Julian's smile faltered. "The doctor said 7 days?" "If we're lucky." Julian lowered his voice, but Elena, polishing the banister 10 feet away, could still hear. "And the will? Have you updated it?" Richard's jaw tightened. "That's what you're worried about." "I'm worried about the family, Richard. About making sure Victoria's assets are protected. About making sure Margaret is taken care of if... Get out." Julian blinked. "What?" "I said get out of my house." Julian's mask slipped. His expression went cold. "You're upset. I understand. But we need to have a conversation about what happens if Victoria doesn't make it. The foundation, the trust, the estate. You can't just..." Richard stepped closer. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you? Waiting for her to die, so you can start picking over the bones." "That's not fair." "You're right. It's not, which is why you need to leave before I have you removed." Julian glanced at Margaret, looking for support, but she'd already turned away. He straightened his tie, his face hardening. "You'll regret this, Richard. Family doesn't forget." He walked out, but not before his eyes landed on Elena. Just for a second, like he was cataloging her face, deciding whether she mattered. That night, Elena did something she absolutely shouldn't have done. She waited until the house was quiet, until Richard had left for the hospital and Margaret had taken her sleeping pill and the rest of the staff had gone home. Then she went to Richard's office. The door was locked, but Elena had watched Mrs. Calloway open it a dozen times. The spare key was in the kitchen, hidden inside a ceramic canister labeled sugar. Inside the office, everything was exactly as you'd expect from a man trying to save his daughter. Stacks of medical journals, printouts of experimental trials, a corkboard covered in timelines and contact numbers. Elena moved carefully, touching nothing she didn't have to. She found what she was looking for in the bottom drawer of his desk. Victoria's full medical file. Not the sanitized version the doctors handed out. The raw data. Blood work. Genetic analysis. Imaging reports. And there, buried in the appendix, was a section on familial compatibility testing. Richard had been tested. Margaret had been tested. Neither was a viable match. The genetic markers were wrong. Not close enough. Victoria needed someone with near-identical DNA. A sibling would have been ideal. But Victoria was an only child. Elena pulled out her phone and photographed 3 pages. Then she put everything back exactly as she'd found it, locked the office, returned the key, and went to her room in the staff quarters. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the photos on her screen. Her hands were shaking, because she knew something Richard didn't. Victoria wasn't an only child. Not really. The next morning, Richard received a phone call that changed everything. A private clinic in Geneva had identified a potential match. Anonymous donor, willing to fly in immediately. The compatibility markers were better than anything they'd seen. It was the first piece of good news in months. Richard called the hospital, started making arrangements, authorized the wire transfer for the clinic's fees. Margaret cried with relief. But when the clinic called back 2 hours later, the news was different. The donor had withdrawn. No explanation. Just gone. Richard lost his mind. He screamed at the clinic director, threatened lawsuits, offered double the money. It didn't matter. The donor was gone. And Victoria had 6 days left. That's when Elena made her move. She found Richard in the library, staring at nothing. She knocked on the doorframe. "Mr. Ashford?" He didn't look up. "Not now. I think I can help." That got his attention. He turned, his expression somewhere between rage and desperation. "Unless you have a medical degree I don't know about, I don't see how." Elena stepped inside, closed the door behind her. "I want to be tested. As a donor." Richard stared at her. "What?" "I know what Victoria needs. I know the odds. But I want to try." "You're—" He shook his head, like he was trying to process the absurdity. "You're a housekeeper. You don't owe us anything. This isn't, I know. But I'm asking you to let me try." Richard studied her, really looked at her for the first time since she'd been hired. "Why would you do this?" Elena met his eyes. "Because nobody should have to watch someone they care about die when there's a chance to save them." It wasn't a full answer, but it was enough. Richard made a call. Within an hour, Elena was at the hospital, getting her blood drawn. The techs ran the tests with the kind of urgency that came from knowing a 17-year-old girl had less than a week to live. And when the results came back, the room went silent. Elena was a perfect match. Not just compatible. Perfect. The kind of genetic alignment you only saw in immediate family members. The doctor looked at Richard. "This is extraordinary. I've never seen markers this close outside of siblings or—" He stopped. Richard's face had gone white. He looked at Elena, who was sitting very still in the chair, staring at her hands. "Who are you?" Richard asked quietly. Elena didn't answer right away. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. Someone who should have been here a long time ago. The truth came out in pieces. Not in a rush, not in a dramatic confession, but in fragments that built into something too big to ignore. Elena had been born 24 years ago in a county hospital 2 hours north of the city. Her mother's name was Claire Cross. Claire had worked for the Ashford family years before Elena was born, not as a housekeeper, but as Margaret's personal assistant. She'd been young, competent, trustworthy. She traveled with the family, managed schedules, handled sensitive business. And at some point, she and Richard had crossed a line. It wasn't love. It wasn't even an affair in the traditional sense. It was a mistake that happened twice, during a business trip to Seattle. A moment of weakness that both of them regretted immediately. When Claire found out she was pregnant, she told Richard. He panicked. Margaret was pregnant too, 8 weeks ahead of Claire. The timing was a nightmare. Richard offered Claire money. A lot of it. Enough to disappear, start over, raise the child somewhere far away where the scandal wouldn't touch the Ashford name. Claire took the deal. She signed an NDA, took the payout, and left. She told her family she'd gotten a new job out of state. She gave birth to Elena alone, and she never contacted Richard again. But she kept everything. The NDA, the bank transfer records, the letters Richard had sent, cold and legal, making sure she understood the terms. She kept a single photo of herself and Richard at a company event, back when things were still professional. And she told Elena the truth when Elena turned 18. Not out of spite, not even out of regret, just because Elena deserved to know where she came from. Claire died 2 years later. Cancer, fast and brutal. And Elena was left with a choice. Stay angry at a man who'd paid her mother to disappear, or find out who her father really was. She chose the latter. She researched Richard, learned about his business, his reputation, his family, and she learned about Victoria, her half-sister, the girl who had everything Elena never did, a father who claimed her, a name that mattered, a life of private schools and trust funds and security. Elena told herself she just wanted to see them, to understand what kind of people they were. She wasn't looking for a reunion. But then she found out Victoria was dying, and everything changed. Richard sat in the hospital cafeteria, staring at a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Elena sat across from him. She'd laid it all out. shown him the documents, the photos, the timeline. He hadn't said a word in 10 minutes. Finally, "Why didn't you lead with this?" Elena's laugh was bitter. "Would you have believed me? A stranger shows up claiming to be your illegitimate daughter, asking to donate a kidney? You would have thrown me out and called security. So you lied your way into my house. I got a job in your house. There's a difference." Richard looked at her. "You could have blackmailed me, gone to the press, destroyed everything. I don't want to destroy anything. I want to save my sister." The word hung between them. Sister. Richard's hands were shaking. "Does Margaret know?" "No. Julian. God, no." Richard rubbed his face. "This is complicated. I know. It's more than complicated. If this gets out, it won't." Richard met her eyes. "How can I trust that?" Elena leaned forward. "Because I'm not here for your money, or your name, or your guilt. I'm here because Victoria is running out of time, and I'm the only person on the planet who can save her. So you can sit here and spiral about the scandal, or you can let me do what I came here to do." Richard stared at her, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he saw a way forward. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay." But neither of them noticed Julian Hayes, sitting 3 tables away, hidden behind a newspaper, listening to every word. The surgery was scheduled for the next day. Elena was prepped, consented, cleared. The transplant team moved with military efficiency. Victoria was too weak to fully understand what was happening, but when Richard told her a donor had been found, she cried. Richard didn't tell her who the donor was. Not yet. There were too many variables, too many things that could go wrong. But the night before the surgery, Elena asked to see her. The nurses hesitated, but Richard approved it. Elena walked into Victoria's room, and for the first time, the two of them were alone. Victoria looked so small in the hospital bed. Her skin was gray, her hair thin, her eyes too large in her gaunt face. But when she saw Elena, she smiled. "You're the housekeeper," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Elena nodded. "I am. Why are you here?" Elena sat down in the chair next to the bed. "Because I wanted to meet you." "That's a weird thing to say." Elena laughed softly. "Yeah, I guess it is." Victoria studied her. "Dad says you're giving me one of your kidneys." "If everything goes well, yeah." "Why?" It was the same question Richard had asked. Elena didn't have a simple answer. "Because you deserve a chance," she said finally. "And because I can." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "Then, what's your name?" "Elena." "That's pretty." "Thanks." Victoria's eyes were starting to close. The medication was kicking in. But before she drifted off, she whispered, "Thank you, Elena." Elena stayed until Victoria fell asleep. Then she stood, walked to the door, and found Richard waiting in the hallway. "She's going to hate me when she finds out," Elena said. Richard didn't deny it. "Maybe. Or maybe she'll understand." "I don't need her to understand. I just need her to survive." Richard nodded. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For what I did to your mother. For the years you didn't have." Elena looked at him. "I don't need your apology either. But if we're both still standing when this is over, maybe we can figure out what comes next." Richard extended his hand. Elena shook it, and in that moment, a fragile agreement was made. But downstairs, in the hospital parking lot, Julian Hayes was on the phone with a lawyer, explaining that Richard Ashford had a secret daughter and asking how much leverage that gave them. The surgery took 9 hours. Elena went in first, the extraction team working with the kind of precision that came from doing this 100 times before. When they removed her kidney, it was healthy, pink, perfect. Victoria's surgery started immediately after. The transplant team moved fast, connecting arteries, suturing, flooding the new organ with her blood, and waiting for it to take. Richard spent the entire day in the waiting room, pacing, praying, checking his phone every 30 seconds. Margaret was there too, though she didn't know the full story yet. She thought the donor was anonymous, a stranger moved by compassion. When the surgeon finally emerged, his mask was down and he was smiling. "It took," he said. "Both of them are stable." Richard almost collapsed with relief. Margaret sobbed into his shoulder. And for the first time in months, the Ashford family had hope. But that hope lasted exactly 16 hours. Because the next morning, Julian Hayes walked into Richard's office with a briefcase and a smile that could cut glass. "We need to talk," Julian said. Richard looked up from his desk. "Get out." "I don't think you want me to do that. Not when I know about Elena." Richard's blood went cold. Julian set the briefcase on the desk and opened it. Inside were copies of everything. The NDA Claire had signed, the bank transfer records, photos of Elena entering the hospital, and, most damning, an audio recording from a cafeteria conversation. Julian had been wearing a wire. "You recorded me?" Richard said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I protected the family," Julian corrected, "because God knows you weren't going to." "What do you want?" Julian sat down, uninvited. "Margaret gets 60% of the estate when you die. Victoria gets the other 40. But if Victoria dies, her share goes to Margaret. And if Margaret dies, everything comes to me as next of kin." Richard saw where this was going. Victoria's going to live. Maybe. But she's also going to find out her father cheated on her mother and paid off his mistress. That her miraculous donor is actually her illegitimate half-sister. That the family she thought she knew is built on lies. Julian leaned forward. "How do you think she'll handle that, Richard? A sick 17-year-old who just found out her whole life is a fraud." Richard's hands curled into fists. "What do you want?" Julian smiled. "I want you to update the will. Give me controlling interest in the foundation. Transfer the Chicago properties into a trust one manage. And make sure that when the dust settles, I'm not just Margaret's brother. I'm a voting partner in Ashford Industries." "You're blackmailing me." "I'm negotiating. There's a difference." Richard stood. "No." Julian's smile didn't waver. "Then I go to Margaret. And the press. And by the end of the week, your company's stock will tank. Your wife will divorce you. And Victoria will know exactly what kind of man her father really is." Richard wanted to hit him. Wanted to throw him through the window. But Julian had him cornered. And they both knew it. "I need time," Richard said finally. Julian closed the briefcase. "You have 48 hours. After that, I make calls." He stood, straightened his tie, and walked out. Richard waited until the door closed. Then he pulled out his phone and called the one person who might actually understand what was at stake. He called Elena. Elena was still in the hospital, recovering in a room 2 floors above Victoria's. The pain meds made everything soft around the edges, but when her phone buzzed and she saw Richard's name, she answered immediately. He told her everything. About Julian, the recording, the blackmail, the 48-hour deadline. When he finished, Elena was quiet for a long time. "He's going to destroy you," she said finally. "He's going to try." "What do you want me to do?" Richard's voice was raw. "I don't know. I needed you to know. In case he comes after you too." Elena closed her eyes. "He won't. I don't have anything he wants." "You're my daughter. That makes you a target." Elena laughed bitterly. "I'm the daughter you paid to disappear. I don't think Julian sees me as a threat." "Maybe not, but I do." Elena opened her eyes. "What?" Richard hesitated. "You saved Victoria. You came into my life and fixed the one thing I couldn't fix. I don't know what happens next, but I know I'm not going to let Julian weaponize you." "Richard, I'm going to fight him. I don't know how yet, but I will. And I need you to trust me." Elena thought about her mother, about the years of silence and distance and shame, about the choice Claire had made to take the money and run. Elena wasn't her mother. "Okay," she said. "I trust you. But if we're doing this, we're doing it smart." "What do you have in mind?" Elena sat up, ignoring the pull of the surgical incision. "Julian thinks he has leverage because he knows the secret. But secrets only work if people care. What if we take away his power by telling the truth first?" Richard was silent. "You want to go public?" "No. I want to tell the people who matter before Julian can spin it. Margaret, Victoria, the board if we have to. Control the narrative." "Margaret will never forgive me." "Maybe not, but she'll forgive you faster if it comes from you than from Julian's lawyers." Richard exhaled slowly. You're asking me to blow up my marriage. I'm asking you to save it. There's a difference. Richard looked out the window of his office, at the city stretching out below him, at the empire he'd built on the back of impossible decisions. Okay, he said finally. Let's do it. But before they could make another move, the hospital intercom crackled to life. Code Blue, Room 412. Code Blue, Room 412. Room 412 was Victoria's room. Richard dropped the phone and ran. And this is where everything shifted, because now it wasn't just about saving Victoria's life. It was about protecting the truth they'd buried for years. Richard hit the stairs at full speed, his heart hammering in his chest. By the time he reached the 4th floor, a team of doctors and nurses were already flooding into Victoria's room. He tried to follow, but a nurse blocked him. Sir, you need to stay back. That's my daughter. I know, but you need to let us work. Through the doorway, Richard could see Victoria's body convulsing, monitors screaming, hands moving in controlled chaos. Someone called for epinephrine. Someone else adjusted the bed. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The convulsions ceased. Victoria went still. One of the doctors checked her pulse, her breathing, and after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. We're stable. Richard sagged against the wall. The nurse who'd stopped him put a hand on his shoulder. She's okay. It was a rejection scare, but the immunosuppressants are working. She's going to be okay. Richard nodded, unable to speak. He stayed in the hallway while they stabilized her, while they adjusted her meds and ran tests and made sure the transplant hadn't failed. When they finally let him in, Victoria was awake. Pale, shaken, but awake. Dad, her voice was so small. Richard crossed to her bedside and took her hand. I'm here. What happened? Your body got a little confused. But you're okay. The kidney's working. You're going to be fine. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. I thought I was dying. You're not. Not anymore. She squeezed his hand. I want to meet the donor. I need to thank them. Richard's throat tightened. You will. Soon. I promise. But even as he said it, he knew the clock was ticking. Julian's deadline was still in play. And if Richard didn't act fast, the truth would come out in the worst possible way. He stayed with Victoria until she fell asleep. Then he went back to his office and made a decision. He called Margaret. She answered on the second ring. Is Victoria okay? I heard there was a code. She's fine. Stable. But I need you to come to the hospital. Now. Margaret hesitated. Richard, what's wrong? Just come. Please. She arrived 30 minutes later, her face tight with worry. Richard met her in a private consultation room, the kind they used for delivering bad news. Margaret sat down, her hands folded in her lap. You're scaring me. Richard sat across from her. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen until I'm finished. Margaret's expression shifted. What did you do? Richard told her everything. About Claire. About Elena. About the affair that happened 24 years ago. The payout. The NDA. About how Elena had shown up as a housekeeper, tested as a donor, saved Victoria's life. About the fact that their daughter was alive because of a girl Margaret didn't know existed. When he finished, the room was silent. Margaret's face was unreadable. You cheated on me, she said finally. Yes. You paid her to disappear. Yes. And you never told me. I'm telling you now. Margaret stood, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked to the window, stared out at the parking lot below. Richard waited. He didn't apologize, didn't make excuses. He just waited. Does Victoria know? Margaret asked, her back still to him. Not yet. Julian. Richard stiffened. He knows. He's blackmailing me with it. Margaret turned. Of course he is. I'm not giving him what he wants. Then he'll destroy you. Destroy us. Maybe. But I'm not letting him weaponize our family. Margaret's laugh was hollow. Our family. What family, Richard? The one built on lies? The one where you have a daughter I didn't know about? Margaret. Is she downstairs? Elena. Yes. I want to meet her. Richard blinked. What? You heard me. I want to meet the girl who saved my daughter's life. The girl you erased. Richard nodded slowly. Okay. They went down to Elena's room together. Elena was sitting up in bed, scrolling through her phone, when they walked in. She looked up, saw Margaret, and went very still. Margaret studied her, took in the dark hair, the shape of her face, the way she held herself. You have his eyes, Margaret said finally. Elena didn't know how to respond to that. Margaret crossed the room and sat in the chair next to the bed. Thank you for what you did for Victoria. Elena nodded. You're welcome. Did you come here to hurt us? No. Did you come here for money? No. Margaret's voice broke. Then why? Elena met her eyes. Because I have a sister, and she was dying, and I could save her. It's that simple. Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she reached out and took Elena's hand. I don't know if I can forgive him, she said softly, but I can thank you. So thank you. Elena's eyes stung. You're welcome. Margaret stood, composed herself, and walked out without looking at Richard. But she didn't file for divorce. She didn't call a lawyer. She just went home. And that, Richard knew, was the closest thing to forgiveness he was going to get. Julian's deadline came and went. Richard didn't call, didn't negotiate, didn't transfer a single asset. Julian showed up at the estate the next morning, furious. You're making a mistake, he said. Richard met him at the door. No, you did. Julian held up his phone. I have the recordings, the documents. I can bury you. Go ahead. Julian blinked. What? Go to the press. Release the recordings. Do whatever you think you need to do. Because Margaret knows. Victoria will know soon. And the only person you're going to hurt is yourself. You're bluffing. Richard stepped closer. Try me. Julian's jaw tightened. You'll lose everything. Maybe. But you'll lose more. Because the second you go public with this, I'm going public with what you've been doing. Julian's expression flickered. I don't know what you're. The offshore accounts. The insider trading. The bribes you paid to push the Chicago zoning deal through. I've been digging, Julian. And I found everything. It was a bluff. Mostly. Richard had suspicions, but no hard proof. But Julian's reaction told him everything he needed to know. Julian went pale. You can't prove any of that. Maybe not. But I can make enough noise that the SEC starts asking questions. And once they start looking, they don't stop. Julian stared at him. You destroy your own family to protect your bastard daughter? She's not a bastard. She's my daughter. And yeah, I would. Julian's hands clenched into fists. This isn't over. Yes, it is. Get off my property. Julian left. He didn't go to the press. Didn't release the recordings. Within a week, he quietly relocated to Singapore, citing new business opportunities. Margaret stopped speaking to him entirely, and Richard knew they'd won. Not cleanly, not without scars, but they'd won. 2 weeks later, Victoria was strong enough to leave the hospital. The transplant had taken. Her color was coming back. She could walk without getting dizzy. The doctors called it a miracle, but Richard knew better. It was just Elena. Victoria still didn't know the full truth. Richard had asked Elena to wait, to let Victoria recover before dropping that particular bomb. Elena agreed, but the day Victoria was discharged, she asked to see Elena. They met in the hospital courtyard, under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Victoria was in a wheelchair, still weak, but smiling. Elena sat on a bench nearby. I wanted to thank you, Victoria said. In person. Not through my dad or the doctors. Just thank you. Elena nodded. You're welcome. They told me you're a perfect match. That the odds of that happening with a random donor are basically impossible. Elena's heart started to race. Yeah, lucky I guess. Victoria tilted her head. Except you're not random, are you? Elena went very still. What do you mean? I've been thinking about it. About how you knew where everything was in our house. How you looked at my room, like you'd been there before. How you stared at that photo of me and Marlowe. Elena's throat tightened. Victoria wheeled closer. And then I asked the doctors about genetic compatibility. About what it takes to be a perfect match. And they said siblings. Or parents. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. So I'm going to ask you one time, and I need you to tell me the truth. Are you my sister? Elena looked at her. At this girl she'd come to save. This girl who deserved honesty. Yes, Elena said quietly. I am. Victoria exhaled slowly. How long have you known? My whole life. Your dad didn't know I existed until 2 weeks ago. Does my mom know? She does now. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then, do you hate us? For having everything you didn't? Elena shook her head. No, I don't hate you. I never did. But you must have been angry. Sometimes. Yeah, but not at you. You didn't do anything wrong. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Neither did you. Elena's composure cracked. I didn't come here to ruin your life. I know. You came here to save it. Victoria reached out, and Elena took her hand. They sat like that for a long time. Two sisters who'd never had the chance to know each other, holding on in the aftermath of everything that had tried to keep them apart. What happens now? Victoria asked finally. Elena smiled through her tears. I don't know, but we'll figure it out. And for the first time since this whole thing started, Elena believed it. 6 months later, the Ashford estate looked different. Not physically, same house, same gardens, same grand facade. But the energy inside had shifted. Victoria was back in school, finishing her senior year remotely while she regained her strength. Margaret had started therapy, working through the betrayal and the grief and the complicated reality of her husband's choices. Richard had stepped back from some of his business commitments, spending more time at home, trying to rebuild what he'd broken. And Elena had moved into one of the guest houses on the property. Not as a housekeeper, as family. It wasn't perfect. There were still hard conversations, moments of tension, days when Margaret couldn't look at Elena without seeing the affair that had created her. But there were also dinners together, quiet evenings watching movies, moments where Victoria would text Elena some random observation, and Elena would text back, and they'd fall into a rhythm that felt like what sisters were supposed to be. One evening, Richard found Elena in the library, reading one of Victoria's old favorites. He sat down across from her. I've been thinking, he said. Elena looked up. About making this official. Legally. I want to add you to the will. Make sure you're protected. Elena set the book down. I don't need your money, Richard. I know, but you're my daughter, and you deserve to be recognized as such. Elena considered it. What does Margaret think? She thinks it's the right thing to do. Victoria agrees. Elena smiled. Then okay. Richard nodded, relieved. There's something else. What? Victoria wants to go public. With the whole story. Her illness, the transplant, She thinks it might help other families going through similar things. Elena's stomach tightened. That's a big step. I know, but it's her choice. And she wants to know if you're okay with it. Elena thought about her mother, about the years of silence and shame, about the choice Claire had made to stay hidden. Elena wasn't her mother. Yeah, she said finally. I'm okay with it. 3 months later, Victoria published an essay in a major magazine. It was titled, The Sister I Didn't Know I Had. It told the whole story, the illness, the donor search, the revelation, the recovery. It was honest, raw, and deeply human. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from families dealing with similar situations, from donor recipients, from people who'd been estranged from their siblings and were inspired to reach out. Victoria and Elena did a handful of interviews together. They talked about what it was like to meet as adults, to build a relationship from scratch, to navigate the complicated reality of shared blood and separate histories. And through it all, they were honest. About the hard parts. About the moments that didn't feel like a fairy tale. About the fact that family wasn't always easy, but it was worth fighting for. On Victoria's 18th birthday, the whole family gathered at the estate. Margaret had planned a small party. Just close friends, a few cousins, nothing extravagant. Victoria was still cautious about big crowds, still building her stamina. But she was alive, healthy, laughing. At one point, she pulled Elena aside. I have something for you, Victoria said. She handed Elena a small wrapped box. Inside was a necklace, a simple silver chain with two pendants. One was a V. The other was an E. It's cheesy, Victoria said, grinning. I know, but I wanted you to have it. Elena's eyes stung. It's perfect. We match. Victoria held up her wrist, showing an identical bracelet. Because we're sisters. And I don't care how complicated the story is. You're family. Elena pulled her into a hug, careful of Victoria's still healing body. You're family too. They stood like that, holding each other, while the party continued around them. And Richard, watching from across the room, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because everything was fixed. Not because the past had been erased. But because, against all odds, his family had survived. And maybe, just maybe, they'd come out stronger. Years later, when people asked Victoria about her illness, she'd tell them the medical details, the autoimmune disease, the transplant, the recovery. But when they asked how she survived, she'd tell them about Elena, about the sister who showed up out of nowhere and saved her life, about the choice to turn pain into connection, about the way family could be built, not just born. And Elena, who'd spent so much of her life on the outside looking in, finally had a place to belong. Not because of money or names or estates, but because when it mattered most, she'd made the choice to show up, to be brave, to save the person who mattered, even when it cost her everything. That's the story. Two sisters, one impossible situation, and the choice that changed everything. So here's my question for you. If you found out you had a sibling you never knew existed, would you reach out? Would you take the risk? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if this one hit you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this coming, and I think you'll want to hear them. Thanks for listening.